When the Cake framework, we added, like you mentioned, this additional layer that sits between the application and the solvers, which we just call the permissioning layer. I think it was the observation that so far everyone has taken a sort of a view that a user goes to a chain and interacts with the chain and has like assets sitting on a chain. But I sort of take a different perspective, which is actually like chains have users. And those users have state, and that state exists on like multiple different execution environment, but it's all controlled by generally the same key. And so it's more that like a user account has multiple different chains.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Sei. After several months of effort, Sei's V2 launch is live. Woo! Let's go and introduce the first high-performance parallelized VM to the world. Stay up to date by following Sei at Sei, that's SEI Network, or you can experience the speed firsthand at sei.io today. Thank you very much for being a partner to Bell Curve Sei. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Re.al, a new permissionless L2 built on the Arbitrum Orbit stack by DeFi natives for DeFi natives for tokenized real-world assets. It's a very cool chain. Highly recommend that you go check it out. And they just started their rewards program. So you can type in re.al/rewards. You can use the code in the show notes below. All right, thanks everyone. On with the show.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. Before we jump in, quick disclaimer. The views expressed by my co-host today are their personal views, and they do not represent the views of any organization with which the co-hosts are associated with. Nothing in the episode is construed or relied upon as financial, technical, tax, legal, or other advice. You know the deal. Now, let's jump into the episode.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Bell Curve. This is a special episode. I'm joined by last season's co-host, Hart Lambur. Hart, good to have you back on the show, man.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be back and happy to be doing this live and in person.
Yeah, this is a live episode. I think I've only recorded a couple live podcasts ever, so that makes this special. And today we're also joined by Stephane of OneBalance. Stephane, welcome, man.
Hello. This is fun. I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, we're coming at you live from Brussels right now, EthCC.
We are.
Yeah. Everyone is unmugged, I trust, which is good.
I had a close call.
Did you really?
Yeah, a couple nights ago, just outside my hotel, someone was like being very aggressive, pulled a knife. I had to like get running. It was like...
Really?
Yeah, it was kind of scary.
Oh, man.
Did you yell at them in French?
No, but he was yelling at me in French a lot.
Interesting choice for a conference. I did not realize Brussels was a was a bit of a safety hazard, but...
Political capital of Europe.
That's...
Okay, let's stay on topic.
We should stay on topic here. Yeah, we didn't mean to get political. Okay. So this will be a really fun callback episode to the multi-chain season that Hart and I did together. And Stephane, we should have had you on the show here because you've been really pushing the envelope forward here with your Cake framework, and then OneBalance, I think, is a really interesting project that sort of builds on that. But before we get into the weeds of OneBalance, can you just describe this framework that you have of Cake?
Yeah, of course. I feel very grateful to be able to work on this problem again. This was something that I had initially started working on back in 2019, and I had like built this framework to be able to do like chain abstraction across Ethereum and all of its testnets, which like in retrospect was a very useless thing to do.
Or not, man. Or not.
Or
right?
not.
Like,
Yeah, it led to this.
planted the seeds.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And so to be able to like reapproach this after my Flashbots journey and everything that I learned there about MEV sort of allowed me to bring a whole new perspective to it, which is that actually in any sort of cross-chain interactions for users, MEV like plays a really, really important component to it. And so when we approached it from a research perspective of trying to put together a framework that outlines all the different components that need to be working in coordination to be able to provide this sort of seamless cross-chain UX experience. And maybe for like listeners that like aren't exactly quite sure what like chain abstraction really means, just imagine that you have a CeFi-like experience, so like working, doing something on Binance or Coinbase, but it's fully non-custodial. That's really sort of the holy grail. Is that you sort of don't see that you're interacting with a chain. You don't have to think about gas, and you don't have to think about bridging. You just directly go and take the actions that you want to take, but you still have the great properties of being non-custodial.
So you just click buttons is the way I like to think about it.
I guess we always just click buttons.
No, but seriously, I want it to be like my version of this is like you're just clicking and the buttons aren't switch network and like authorized thing. They're not. The buttons are just I'm clicking the button to do the action I want to do.
It's one-click experience.
One-click experience.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good tagline.
That is it's free marketing.
OneBalance, one click.
OneBalance, one click.
Wow. This is great. We need to talk more often. So yeah, the cake framework was like this research, like, having the benefit of everyone who spent so much time and money and effort building up the components of the solution. It was clear to me that it made no sense to try to come in and like rebuild the entire thing from zero. So I wanted to sort of see how all the pieces of the puzzle came together. The main insight, I think, in the cake framework is the idea that to provide a sort of seamless cross-chain experience, to do chain abstraction, we really need to introduce a solver layer that's able to do routing or take operations on behalf of users. And the question is, how do you sort of convert the transaction supply chain, where like solvers are mostly used as searchers and doing MEV, towards something that provides a productive use case of helping fulfill whatever desires or intents that the users have. So it was the K framework came from that, and it's been great to sort of have a unifying flag for everyone who's working on this problem to come and share discussion and create common language around it.
So maybe because, well, I have a bias here too from my own intent-based perspective with Across, but the cake framework, to go into the layers of the cake here. Like, actually, Stephane, do you think of this as something that is intent-centric? Like, or do you actually think of it as more generalized than that in your mind?
Can you tell me what intent-centric means?
I mean the idea that a user declares what they want to do, and we can make this not like, make this more constrained. I want to move from chain A, asset X on chain A to asset Y on chain B, and maybe do a thing. Mm-hmm. That's the thing. That's the quote unquote
bridge,
intent.
swap and call.
Bridge, swap, and call. Mm-hmm. And I want to specify that in a place, like you go into layers of the cake, but kind of top of the cake. And that is how bridge, swap, and call works to create this unified Ethereum experience.
I would say so. Yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it. Like, the mental model that I have around intents and how they differ from regular transactions is a regular transaction defines the input, whereas an intent defines the output. And then when you define the output, you need to create an entire infrastructure that's able to securely fulfill that and provide it to the users. And yeah, I definitely think that's what the cake framework aims to provide.
Yeah. Okay. So then going into the layers of the cake here, right? And maybe I'll do the throwback to our season, because in our season we did talk about this to some extent, but kind of from a 3-layer cake framework. And this is the way I've generally looked at the world with Across, where you have like intent generation, sort of the DApp or application that's generating the intent of what the user wants to do. And again, we're going to call this like bridge, swap, and call. I like that.
I do too.
Constraining factor.
Got 2 taglines out of this podcast. Doing work here.
OneBalance, one click. Bridge, swap, and call.
Advisor shares.
Too soon. So second layer in this world was like the solver layer. Relayers, fillers, solvers that are going to fill the user in this bridge, swap, or call, and fill the user with their own capital, importantly, and able to do that extremely quickly, which is something we're going to get into. And then the bottom layer is the settlement layer, which actually, the way I look at it is I think of it as like escrow plus intent fulfillment verification. So it's escrowing the user assets and only releasing them to the solver after we verify that the intent was fulfilled. Do you agree with that? And then why don't we add in the 4th layer of the cake that I think you guys have been focused on?
I definitely agree with it. I think that's the correct way to think about it. When the cake framework, we added, like you mentioned, this additional layer that sits between the application and the solvers, which we just call the permissioning layer. I think it was the observation that so far everyone has taken a sort of a view that a user goes to a chain and interacts with the chain and has like assets sitting on a chain. But I sort of take a different perspective, which is actually like chains have users, and those users have state, and that state exists on like multiple different execution environment, but it's all controlled by generally the same key. And so it's more that like a user account has multiple different chains. And what you're trying to do when you're introducing a solver layer is you're saying this solver can take some actions on subsets of my state. So you're really issuing a permission to the solver to do something with the validity condition. If the solver fulfills this requirement, they get Y asset. And just the observation that all of this ends up being permissions over user states that led us down the track of sort of adding this permissioning layer and seeing like, oh wow, there's all kinds of complex permissions that you can do. So the very like coarse grained permissions that we've had so far, which are like infinite approvals for ERC20 tokens, are very restricted in what you can do relative to something that can like literally run an entire like role-based access control policy with like full simulations over calls traces and whatnot. The other component that the permissioning layer adds is protection against equivocation. This can get a little bit technical, but for a solver to bring a state transition request on chain on behalf of the user, it needs to know that the user is going to have those assets still by the time that the solver tries to get paid out. And typically the way that this is done is that the user first interacts with the settlement layer before passing a message to the solver. But you can offer those guarantees directly at the permissioning layer, such that you don't have that in the critical path of the execution.
So I think it'd be then fair to say that this permissioning layer and what you just described, and we can try to build some more analogies for this too, but this permissioning layer and what you just described kind of led directly to this product, OneBalance.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, the name is great, right? So OneBalance, and the concept here in terms of what you're saying, where a user effectively wants like one key. I'll try my own analogies here, and we'll let you go deeper on this. But one key to control state on different chains, and hence it's sort of this abstraction that OneBalance becomes that gateway, give or take.
Yeah, it makes all the different rollups act as if they're just one chain, and so the user just has ETH. And then they can use the ETH to do anything, anywhere. They can use it to do stuff on Solana. They can use it to do stuff on Bitcoin L2s. They can do stuff on any rollup. And the interesting part is, not only do they not have to like think about the bridging, but they also, much like in a cross, they get to execute at the speed of the destination chain. So they no longer need to wait for like an Ethereum transaction to go through. They're still holding their assets on Ethereum, but they could just transact at the speed of Solana. Yeah,
and the constraint here, well, maybe they were getting too early, but you have to get assets into OneBalance.
Yeah.
Right. And once you're, I don't know, you keep going. Like so OneBalance gives us this sort of, well, let's introduce the term credible commitment machine, because I like the term.
Me too.
Commitment machine, yeah. And we're not going to call it a CMM. We'll say CCM.
Fine. This is all just like branding training for me.
But yeah,
from the best, so this is good.
Describe it. So like what because you talk about credible commitments, which frankly is like such a cool concept generally that blockchains give you, that not a lot of even like TradFi systems, your credible commitment is enforced by like legal recourse, which is bullshit and isn't that credible. So yeah, what is this concept? How does it apply to OneBalance, and what's it give you?
Yeah, so the sort of catch line that OneBalance has been going with is that we bring credible accounts to Web3. To do this, we sort of are implementing the Credible Stack, which is a framework that's based off of the Cake framework, but specifically oriented towards these sort of cross-chain experiences that I was referring to. So credible commitment machines are things that like have been explored for a long time. I think a lot of the theory around it emerged in like the 80s and like 90s, and the idea was, how do you get enforcement of contracts without relying on like the state to enforce it?
If you mean the state, like the government state,
yeah,
in a sense.
sorry.
Yeah,
that's also an overloaded word, but yeah, without like a nation state, like the U.S. government, and specifically the like judicial branch of the U.S. government to like be able to enforce it, because maybe this is like a little abstract, but like that is also a consensus finding mechanism, right? Like the fact that you have like a jury that like evaluates a bunch of...
It's the original consensus finding mechanism.
Exactly. And so it's a very nice sort of credible commitment machine that you can say like, hey, if we both sign this contract, then I'm like bound to this, even if in the future I may want to defect, because there's this external thing that's going to come in and sort of put me in jail if I don't, follow it, or, force me to pay with the threat of violence. And a lot of the research or theory of cypherpunk or whatever it is in the 80s and 90s was around, is there a way to enforce these types of commitments without the threat of violence? And the entire sort of theory of smart contracts came from this, and was in many ways the inception of why Vitalik ended up starting Ethereum, was to be able to create this credible commitment machine. So all blockchains really are credible commitment machines. The observation that I have with this is you don't need to have 500,000 validators attest to every single commitment that you make. In many ways, that's overpaying for what you actually need if you're just transaction between two people. And so these blockchains that are designed with global consensus in mind sort of only provide a single way to enforce these credible commitments. But for example, in the case of chain abstraction, when you're really just trying to create a commitment between a user and a solver, you don't need to have the entire network of Ethereum attest to a commitment.
So let's make a concrete example here, because I think it's super cool and I want to make sure everybody groks this. So the naive way that you have a user and a solver interact here would be user says, okay, here's my intent, and they lock their assets initially with a transaction. They lock their assets into effectively an escrow account. And the solver will only go and compete their fill after I'll use the word think, those assets are locked in that escrow account. Mm-hmm. And where you and I have a lot of conversations, right, is this is how a cross works today. Mm-hmm. So the deposit transaction locks user assets in that escrow account. And then if solvers trust the pre-confirmation, for example, coming from the Arbitrum or Optimism sequencer, they'll go and fill them on the destination chain basically immediately, waiting only for the pre-confirmation to come back. Mm-hmm. The flip side, the other way of doing this, the OneBalance way of doing this, is the user and the solver enter into a different type of credible commitment kind of ahead of time, where the user assets get, you tell me if you agree with this language, but the user assets get escrowed into this credible commitment machine that says the user cannot immediately withdraw them, but the solver knows that the assets live there and the solver can spend them to fill user transactions without waiting for like a per transfer deposit.
Yeah, there's a few things maybe in there that I would touch on.
Yeah.
The core point that you're making, which is, so far when we've thought of bridging, it's like, okay, you want to bridge something, you escrow your assets on chain A, you wait for finality, then there's a message that goes to chain B, and then you like have your assets on chain B. That's kind of like been a transaction by transaction basis flow. Yeah,
let's name that, because this is a core thing that like you and I are very aligned on, that flow sort of sucks. It's like poor UX. So I'm going to call that like message-based bridging, where you like have finality on the origin chain and then you send a message to the destination chain. But yeah, keep going.
Yeah, and then you can speed it up by saying like, okay, maybe you don't need finality, you just need a belief that there's a reasonable likelihood that's going to settle, and then you have the fast bridges. But this all focuses on this like transaction by transaction basis on the origin chain of creating this lock. The OneBalance inside is just like, actually you can like lock all of your assets in your account at once, and then at any time you can issue messages to solvers to do transaction on destination chains without needing to issue another transaction on the origin chain. So it's like a one-time upfront migration of the account to enable it to do anything on any chain without needing to do a transaction by transaction signature. And then I think the term escrow is perhaps overloaded as well. Really what you're putting your assets into is a time lock. So you're saying that these assets are sitting in a contract for which I still have full ownership over. No one can take any action against this contract without me requesting it. But if I want to withdraw these assets, I need to trigger a time lock to that sort of delays. So this is somewhat similar to like the idea that you're depositing inside of a roll up, right? And then you get your assets minted in the roll up, and then you can withdraw, but you have to sort of like send the message to like the L1 contract, wait for the finality proof, the fraud proof period, and then you have your assets. So roll-ups are also time locks rather than escrows.
Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Sei. Sei believes that the EVM is here to stay, but they also believe that the EVM in its current iteration lacks performance and scalability for developers. Sei's recent V2 upgrade has introduced the first high-performance parallelized EVM, which has coupled lightning-fast block times and finality of just 390 milliseconds. That is sub 400 millisecond block time. Very, very cool. This V2 upgrade unlocks a new design space with 100x the throughput, even the fastest EVM L2. So if you're a developer who spent most of your time building in the EVM, you can now build on Sei, faster block times, much quicker finality. You get a lot of the benefits of the environment that you're used to. So if you're a developer, definitely go check them out. And thank you very much, Sei, for sponsoring this episode. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by Re.al, Re.al. They're a new permissionless L2 built on Arbitrum Orbit for tokenized RWAs. So basically they've got this portfolio of real world assets that actually exist out there that generate yields. They import them on chain and find ways to reward their users very creatively. So one of the cool things about Re.al is that it's the first L2 where 100% of profits from transaction fees and fees from protocols deployed onto the chain accrue back to the L2 governance token. And currently, I mentioned this at the top of the episode, but they have a reward program going on for early users of the chain where 10% of the RWA tokens are being distributed, which is very cool. So you as a user can go over there and provide concentrated liquidity, trade, borrow, and leverage tokenized RWAs, including T-bills, real estate, and tokenized basis trades. So again, head over to re.al/rewards, and you can use the code found in the show notes here. Tell them that I sent you. Thanks, Re.al, for making this possible.
I'm curious about the economics of the solver layer moving one step below here, because we're all operating on the assumption here, or first of all, we don't really know which apps are going to gain a lot of traction, like I think which is a big is going to have a large impact on what these economics look like. But we're all just kind of assuming that solvers will come in and execute all of these things on behalf of users. And I think broadly that's probably true, but it strikes me also that depending on what action we're asking solvers to take, the economics probably look pretty different. Can you just say a little bit about, like, I mean, both of you, honestly, like what you think this ultimate this solver layer is going to look like, and then what do the economics look like for these different actors?
I'm very curious to hear Hart's perspective. Obviously, he has a system in production that deals with solvers. My perspective is mostly from like showing up at events and gossiping with them. So
that's a good perspective, yeah.
And we were at EthCC right now in Brussels, right? And there was this event, searcher.wtf, and I moderated this panel. And like my main question was like, how are any of you making money? And they were kind of all looking at each other, and they're like, well, it's mostly token subsidies, to be honest. And so there's like question marks around this, I think, throughout the industry. I sort of have opinions on how this market is likely to evolve, but I would also say it's like we're still at the stage of these solvers being like individual dudes sitting in like their basement rather than being like sophisticated firms. And so this will greatly evolve over the course of time, and as additional order flow comes into the pipeline.
Yeah, well, okay, so I'll keep this short because Stephane, this is about you, right? But since the question is on solver economics. We get Across sometimes gets unfairly critiqued as saying, oh wait, you guys just have like one centralized solver you guys run. Or the other critique we get is, oh, it's just Wintermute running a solver for you. And both those things are entirely untrue. We actually have, it really is just economics at work. Solvers in the Across system make a small fee, and it's really quite small because the bridge is pretty cheap, but the fee more than compensates their costs. And it's permissionless entry into this market. And we now have about 15 to 20 active solvers. We don't really know who they are. They are mostly like Stephane, like you said, they're mostly one-man shops, like guys in their basement doing this. Know them by Discord handles type thing. And they are generally like interested people looking to make a little bit of money building some infrastructure, which is really freaking cool in my opinion. Yeah.
I didn't mean my comment to say that like being a solver is a terrible business model. I think they do provide real value.
Yeah.
And I think it's unlikely that we will see a firm emerge and dominate in the short to medium term. The reason why is it's actually like a really big pain in the ass to integrate like all the routes on like a new chain. And so there's a lot of room for specialization. And then if you use a system like Across, the solver no longer needs to care about both legs. Like they don't need to care about the origin leg and the destination leg. They can specialize on like a specific chain and just providing the execution for that chain, which helps minimize their risk. And so there is room for specialization in this market, and there is definitely room for being compensated for this because it's a lot of work that like most sources don't want to implement themselves. And so exactly how the market shakes out is like sort of unclear, but the theory at least is as order flow increases inside of these systems, they're able to generate, better returns.
So let me this is the framework that I have in my head, and I'd be curious if you guys see this evolving similarly or dissimilarly. But the framework that I found myself thinking of when you were just talking is almost the way the searcher market evolved, where in the beginning it was mostly dudes in their basement for the most part, and then it evolved and kind of segmented into, my understanding of the searcher market today is especially there's like long tail and short tail MEV. Most MEV is short tail, which is sex to dex arbitrage, and there's like a couple big vertically integrated searcher builder, potentially relays that take most of that. But there still is the opportunity for long tail, sort of weird, these that still are searchers in their basement that are able to execute on some amount of and withdraw some amount of profit from the system. So, do you think that the solver market is going to evolve relatively similarly? Because I could imagine like it's going to be a couple big applications in the beginning that are getting most of the volume, and there will probably be some routes, like maybe 80% of the volume follows very similar routes, and it makes sense to me that like a Wintermute or something would just dominate those routes because they could just offer it cheaper than their competitors. But then there'll be some weird chains where it doesn't really make sense for the Wintermutes of the world to integrate, and there'll still be opportunity for like a smaller, more fragmented market. Does that analog kind of hit with you, or do you think it's going to evolve differently?
There's so many things to comment on here.
Yeah.
Maybe like one thing that I would say to this is what I think a lot of the technologies in the Cake framework or the Credible stack are looking to offer, and certainly it's sort of the core thing that OneBalance unlocks, is the ability for solvers to minimize their risk. So solvers kind of have like a few different jobs that they do. They do like liquidity aggregation, they like provide reliable execution, but one of the big parts is that they have to manage risks. This is like both like FX risk over like holding a currency and getting rewarded in a different currency at a different point, but also sort of reorg risk from like operating on a different place. And then another part is equivocation risk, that like an account is not going to pay out, but it's like says that it's going to pay out. So I think the role of people that are building infrastructure in the cake stack, like myself and Hart, is to help solvers manage their risk and minimize the amount of risk that they're exposed to. And that makes the market more efficient. It makes it possible for solo guys to operate for longer periods of times relative to these larger firms that maybe have bigger balance sheets, are able to absorb more volatility, can have like drawdowns for like a longer period of time, and are sort of more sophisticated at predictive modeling. So risk minimization for solvers, I think, is like an important component of the puzzle here. But yeah, there's a ton of other factors that go into how the market dynamic will evolve.
I guess what I'd add, I do think, Mike, at a high level, I agree with that framework here. So the other critique around solver stuff is that it's going to evolve to be like HFT TradFi.
Yeah.
And the core differentiator here is permissionless entry into this system. And like, you cannot start an HFT firm today. It doesn't make sense because there's basically like huge barriers to entry, both regulatorily and like capital and all this other kind of stuff here too.
You cannot start a 1-inch solver today.
Maybe not, but you can start a solver that's filling like some new chain type thing in our space. And so this is just kind of going back to like your analogy of like in MEV searching today, and Stefan, you are far more informed about this from like Flashbot stuff, but I do think of like Sextex arbitrage is dominated by a few firms, and then all these other forms of like MEV capture are much more long tail and like more diversity there.
It's also well, let me even like poke at the idea of, because everyone says that like, oh, dystopia, if the HFT dynamic and TradFi merged, and it's maybe, I don't know, this would be an unpopular thing to say, but is that even that bad if that were to emerge? Like, finance is complicated. Moving assets around the world is a complicated, very specialized task. I know that ideologically it sounds great to say, hey, this could be dudes in their basement, moving your money around, and it's not really clear to me why users would ultimately care that much or want that to be the end state of the market. And we had Dan Robinson, when we did the DEX season, talked about this a lot, where I think with something like Uniswap, people really love the idea of individuals being able to passively market make and be LPs. But, market making is a really difficult task, right? You're managing risk. You're doing a whole bunch of different, very specialized tasks. And it's not, I don't know. I get that we don't really want these systems to be co-opted by, specialized actors and rely on like regulation and things like that to create their moats. But it's also, I don't know. What do you guys think about that? It's not really super clear to me why we should be optimizing around just allowing like basically retail people to do this stuff.
I'd be careful to draw false dichotomies here. I think both will coexist. Different types of flow and different types of demand will be filled by different types of providers. I think there's definitely room for like sophisticated market makers, but if you look at the current, like 1inch or USWAPX flow, like it's all the majors that get filled by them, and then solvers are actually generally better at filling those that don't have liquidity on CeFi and only have liquidity on DeFi. So there's all these questions of like, where does the price discovery happen, and that has a big impact on the type of solvers that are better for those kinds of flow. It may be that the complexity of the intents become an additional vector of specialization here, where you'll have like certain types of solvers specializing on certain types of complex orders, because whatever their simulation graphing libraries are like optimized. Maybe they've built a freaking ASIC that like simulates this like path better. Like there's all kinds of reasons where this the specialization could occur. For sure, having access to capital and like proprietary capital is like a huge edge. So like if you are a market maker like Wintermute, who gets all these like token market making deals where they just have like a bunch of tokens on their balance sheet that they don't have directional risk on, like you have an advantage there for quoting anything that like relies on those tokens. So I think that what we'll see actually is perhaps like an emergent category of solvers that approach token issuers and say, actually, I will do market making for you on all the DeFi platforms. And so instead of like being market making on CeFi being sort of the place where you like get these market maker deals, people would be like, oh, you want your token to be like accessible across all these different chains and make it easy for like users to go from all these different chains, then we'll provide that.
The only thing I want to add, I think we ultimately care about one thing and one thing only, which is what's long run best for the user. And I say long run here because we could imagine sort of an HFT type framework that is really good, really, really cheap for the user in the short term, but creates like an oligopoly that ends up extracting rent, And that's just, again, I'm pretty confident that because of the permissionless entry in our system, that really isn't going to happen. But this is the only thing that I'm concerned with is I don't care if they're professionalized or guys in the basement doing the solving. I care about being a market with free entry that gives the user the best long-run experience that we can build.
Part of our Cake framework post was looking at what are the trade-offs in designing these order flow systems. So I think the place where permissioning comes into the picture is on the private order flow side. So none of the RFQ mechanisms today are permissionless. They all run a whitelist of solvers that have access to the flow. And the reason for that is because there's kind of like fundamental trade-offs in designing these order flow systems between speed, reliability, and price optimality. And generally, like a tool in the toolkit of the mechanism designers for these things is to say, I will have some level of reputation scoring for all of these solvers, and if they dip below something, I will just kick them off my whitelist. And so you can enforce good behavior through just like a whitelist. And so this starts to look quite similar to the way that like permissioning works in TradFi. You end up signing legal contracts with the solvers that say that they have certain quality of fills or whatever else. So designing systems that like do properly maintain the permissionlessness on the order flow side, I think is still an unsolved problem for our space.
Yeah. Also a really fun problem, and one that I think like there's stuff we're working on and stuff Stephane I know we're going to talk on too, but I think there's like very, very fun ways to solve that. And I think it's important because I think the permissioning is bad. That's the thing that I think is not in the long run best interest. And like Across is permissionless today, and then solvers were like the only ones that do that. But that's also because we're not doing swapping between assets. We're just doing
price problem.
We don't have the price problem. And much longer, very interesting conversation around that. But
or can you say more about what is the pricing problem exactly?
So basically, if you are Across doesn't swap between, say, ETH and USDC when you're bridging right now. It just does same asset or like asset bridging. We actually support USDC native to bridged USDC, for example. And when you swap between different assets, you create a lot of MEV, and you need a way to auction off that order to achieve some sort of price optimality or not create like a huge MEV race type thing. Is the TLDR the problem? So
interesting.
Yeah.
It's even in TradFi, this is becoming an issue where the way that like a lot of order flow now is private and gets internalized by like Citadel Securities, and the way that they define, the way that they measure in TradFi, like what optimal price or like good execution looks like, is they match it up to what the user would have got on an exchange. But now, like significantly more order flow is actually moving through these private market making solutions where that's where price discovery is actually happening. And so then there's like, I'm starting to hear this question now come up in crypto as of like how much control do big builders or internalizers have over actually, are they taking a price or are they making the price themselves? And it's literally a problem that's happening in TradFi right now that's unsolved. And I would guess that, all this stuff is very complicated, but I think that's an interesting thing to pay attention to also. Sometimes
we think that just because we're in crypto, we've like solved all the problems. But at least my experience is we kind of just speed run recreating the same problems.
Yeah.
So yeah, price setting I think for block space generally, is still unclear in equilibrium who has the price setting power. This has been something that I've been having more and more conversations with people about, and I think the like ultimate criticism of MEF Boost and block building and PBS, my belief is so long as you have an entity with asymmetric access to information, they will have asymmetric ability to like set prices. And so you need to design systems that don't create those entities. Otherwise, you always end up in the same place.
I don't want to veer too far off course, but then what are your thoughts on PBS as a design philosophy like, in general?
I think PBS should get a Nobel Peace Prize.
Okay, so very supportive then.
I can tell you why. So I think that MEV is like something that just emerges whenever you have groups of people that create a shared reality with each other. And we call that consensus. But that shared reality cannot include the complexity of the individual desires. And so there's some things that are left out whenever you create a shared reality. There's someone that like wants to have something that they cannot get because everyone has to come to an agreement on something. This exists in like any sort of government. It exists in training an LLM. It exists in producing a block for a blockchain. There's some people that have a higher willingness to pay over the output of that consensus finding process. And what PBS is, it's like an incredibly efficient way for the people to have that willingness to pay, to be able to express it with dollars as opposed to with violence or any other like means.
Or latency.
Or latency, right? Which is just another way to express it. So, but you know, in like typical like governance, you know, throughout the ages, you literally had people get assassinated, you know, and you had like coups and all these things that are like violent ways to like change consensus. But this is just like a purely economic way to do it, which is great. It does have side effects though, right? And so for me, at least, my criticism is not of PBS, it's of the idea that we're trying to put so many things on global consensus that really shouldn't be on there. The more things that you get global consensus to do, the more jobs that you give it, the higher the willingness to pay of certain individuals to influence it. And that's just like a fundamental thing that will always occur. You know, this is the philosophical underpinning behind OneBalance in many ways, is to say like, not everything needs global consensus. Like, I want people to be able to come to agreement on things and have a credible way to enforce those agreements that doesn't require the entire world to see it. And if we achieve that, I think we can like significantly relieve the pressure that we put on MEV at the base layer, essentially.
There's a new, like, they're not really public yet, but there's a new L1 that isn't really an L1, which is designed with a lot of the principles that you've just described. Maybe soon TM for a bell curve episode. But can you help? Because I'm with you on that, in that there's an analog here to governments in general. This is like empire built. It's like bundling and unbundling of civilization. It's like lots of small civilizations, and they become a big civilization, and then, you know, there's the group of people becomes so large that you can't find agreement. Much like what's happening in the United States at the current moment, where it's like 50% divided. And so consensus might be failing in even the US right now. But what's the ultimate alternative here? So how does this like translate what more local consensus would look like in a blockchain context? Because even in something like OneBalance, right, we still need to have a global view of state across all of these different, you know, subsections of state. So in a world where we don't have global consensus on the base layer, what does that look like?
Increasingly, the way that I think about things, and I don't have all the answers here. This is like a field of exploration. But increasingly, the way I think about things is individuals associate with other groups of individuals. You can call those association sets. And like Ethereum is a like association set of like everyone that holds ETH and everyone who runs like an ETH node. And there's some things that like I as an individual want to go to that group of people for services of some kind. But I should have the like most seamless way possible to be able to go do what I want to do with different subgroups. And the work that we're doing with OneBalance is sort of enabling accounts to do this directly. So by being able to issue these locks and basically solve the ability to go from one chain to another seamlessly, bringing the group to the individual, it makes it much, much more seamless to interface with different groups. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to OneBalance, actually, I want to do two things. First of all, talk about like where OneBalance is at today, which want you to tell us like what users can do today with OneBalance and kind of the roadmap there. And then maybe we can go into like a bit more of ideation around like what we think the L2 Ethereum network is going to look like, and where chain abstraction, what it ends up looking like, and where it's going to be useful and really shine, and where it might be like less important. But anyways, what's OneBalance? How do users use OneBalance today?
And I would add on to that as well, like what is the UX going to look like here? Because I feel like I've got a good understanding of the value proposition of something like OneBalance, but right now, like the people kind of sign into their MetaMask if they're on Ethereum, right? And then they have to use a cross to get up to do something on Arbitrum or whatever. But what is this in a OneBalance world? Just like what is the user interface going to look like?
Okay, I'll try to tackle all of this.
Yeah.
So
break it up.
Yeah.
First of all, like what can users do today? So we've launched registrations for OneBalance accounts. This allows people to sign up, connect their like existing wallets, and then get on the whitelist. They can also start building their account score. There's going to be like an entire questing thing that allows for people to sort of accelerate how they get access to these accounts.
And where do you go to do that today?
OneBalance.io.
OneBalance.io. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
There's your shill. All right.
Appreciate it.
Link in show notes.
And then for anyone that's looking to build on top of these accounts, so like applications and wallets that want to benefit from what the capabilities that it provides, reach out to us again, OneBalance.io, and we can talk about sort of adding these credible accounts into these applications. To touch on what's the UX. What this allows applications and wallets to do is to completely remove the concept of a bridge, a chain, or gas from the user journey. So you just like never need to expose the users to these things anymore. All they have is assets that they hold and then applications that they want to interface with. And that's really, really kind of like the goal of chain abstraction, right? Like you don't need to think about switching networks. You don't need to think about having enough fee to pay for the gas. You don't need to think about which bridge is going to be able to like be the fastest or whatever. You rely that the application is able to solve all of that for you without exposing it to the users. So that's kind of the core UX.
But I do want to push on because Stefan, I know there's a roadmap here too, but initially the way you get your assets into OneBalance, do you imagine it being like you're moving assets into your OneBalance wallet on Ethereum, on Arbitrum, on Base, on all of them at the same time, kind of when you kind of go live here? Or what do you hypothesize that's going to like look like?
We're doing a lot of work on EIPs to like make this seamless. Today, it means like depositing assets inside of your account contract, and those assets can be deposited from any chain. So you don't need to bridge to do the deposit, but you do need to sort of set up this new account and transfer assets into it. I think initially people will start to think about accounts as like different things. So like this will be their like cross-chain spending account, and they will just like deposit a subset of their assets into that and then use it for all their cross-chain stuff. Eventually, we want to work. We're pushing for 7702 to be adopted and be deployed on Ethereum, which allows for migrating EOAs into smart accounts. And so you can have sort of a one-click, one transaction. Now my account is a credible account and I can use it anywhere. But yeah, that will sort of come with time. That's scheduled to be released sometime in next year with the Petra hard fork.
Yeah. So kind of network structure thing here too, because I do, and maybe you don't want to like wed yourself yet on this, but it just in terms of where users would hold their assets in this world, do you imagine them holding their assets, I mean, mainnet, or really I would think that there needs to be like the kind of mainnet net equivalent on an L2, so like Optimism, Base, Arbitrum would probably be the three candidates? Or do you think that in the world you're imagining, these assets would actually be held on like a different chain? Maybe like, I don't know, like, I don't think you guys are going to do a OneBalance chain, but like conceptually, where do you think this sort of Venmo balance, cross-chain spending account balance will live?
It's funny, like, I think there's always been kind of like this confusion with like ERC20s, where like the question is like, does the ERC20 live in your wallet or does it live on the ERC20 contract? And the answer is it always lives on the ERC20 contract. Like that's where the source of truth is. And everything on top of that is just access control. Like you're creating like a chain of delegation over the balance that says that, okay, now the balance is deposited into the L2 bridge, which like mints a wrapped representation into the L2, which is then deposited into a smart contract, which then has like a multi-sig access control on top of it. And so like when you ask in that construction, where do the assets live? They still live on the ERC20 contract on the base chain. It's just that the chain of permissions is like all the way up into the L2 and with like a complex signature scheme. So for our like purposes specifically, it doesn't matter where the assets are issued. They can be deposited inside of the account, and then the account itself, the permissions are enforced with keys that the user holds. And then this credible commitment machine that enforces that any request that the user makes is considered a valid request for the tokens that are deposited. So practically for us, to start with, we've sort of published a framework that says all the different ways to implement credible commitment machines. The simplest one to start with is a smart contract based framework. So we'll work with a smart contract based framework to start, and then progressively improve the guarantees that it provides as the technology matures.
Stephane, does it matter? Does the path that users move their assets to OneBalance matter? Like for instance, if you start just as an ERC20, but then you move and add another permission, which is like the multi-sig on Optimism, for instance, and then you go to OneBalance, is there some sort of security like issue, like having bridged to a multi-sig first, or does it matter at all?
Technically, it's a different token.
Okay.
Right, which makes it difficult. And this is the whole like asset representation problem. From the OneBalance perspective, it doesn't really matter. So long as the solver is willing to be compensated in this token and the solver believes that that is like a valid representation, then for our purposes, it is. Right? So there will be sort of like a market equilibrium here where like some solvers will like believe that some tokens are too risky and they like won't be willing to support it, which means that like users won't, should not be able to go into them. The way that you prevent users from going into those assets is at the application layer. You like restrict the tokens that you like display for the users.
Interesting.
So to go to like again pontificating on like L2 market structure for a second. In the vision of chain abstraction that I think we all share, where users just like, let's simplify it and say that user assets are just in one place, like on their home chain, which again, like you said, it doesn't have to be conceived that way, but just for simplicity's sake, say it is. And I want to go and use other chains. I can use those other chains seamlessly when spending out of my like my Venmo account like concept. This seems very cool, very useful, but something that you and I both thought a lot about. There is like some overhead associated with the cost of being able to do this. So yeah, Stephane, like we were talking about this bit before the show, but when do you think this degree of chain abstraction is worth it, and when may it not be worth it? And like, do you think that this is going to be like every use case should follow this pattern? Or just what are your thoughts on how this L2 structure evolves?
So the ultimate place where I would like the ecosystem to be, which is every single account, and this is where OneBalance accounts will lean towards, but every account is a rollup. So every user has their own little rollup that they own, that's their account, and it sequences locks over the assets that it has. Solvers listen to these locks and they go do stuff on destination chains. What I expect to happen is that, let's say that you have another rollup that's like a gaming rollup that the user is going to like interface with regularly. They will just deposit some assets into that rollup once and then start doing interactions directly with that rollup, perhaps using the same keys that they use to be able to access OneBalance, but it could be some other keys, right? They may just have like a regular EOA or a smart account there that has like a passkey login. So they will use their main sort of cross-chain account, their main like roll-up place where like they own all the assets to do cross-chain stuff, and then they will deposit into a destination roll-up that's likely to be an application-specific roll-up with an amount that they expect to be using there.
So like concretely, we're like, okay, if it's a gaming roll-up and the thing I'm trying to do is move my player piece from one position to another position, and there's nothing I'm like buying or selling in that interaction, I'm doing this 1,000 times, it might make sense for me to move over some gas money to be able to pay for that and do it cheaply and quickly, right?
I think realistically, like for the gaming roll-ups, the games themselves will just like sponsor the gas.
I think that's accurate
and
too.
And they'll like charge like a one-time fee or like a subscription fee to their users.
Yep.
So they'll abstract away all of that. I think of it more as like Farmville coins or whatever, right? Like,
yep.
You're not going to have Farmville coins in your OneBalance account, but you'll have like USDC. Then you'll buy Farmville coins with that USDC. And implicit to that is this like cross rollup transaction from your rollup account to the Farmville rollup, where like now you have all of those Farmville coins sitting on that rollup.
Yep, this fits with my view too on that use case. So it's like, okay, there's something I want to buy. I can buy it seamlessly from my kind of home chain spending account, and then it fits in the idea from if we take this into like NFT land for a second too. There's a chain like Zora where I'm minting NFTs or buying NFTs or something like that. I could interact with Zora seamlessly in this chain abstraction world by spending from my home chain and having that interaction just paid for and happen and execute on the destination chain.
A lot of this comes down to like one-time interactions versus repeat interactions. For commerce, I think a lot of commerce is like one-time interactions. So it'll be like, I have my OneBalance account, I'm connecting it to the Zora app, I'm purchasing an NFT. And then like now the NFT is in my OneBalance account. And then behind the scenes, you have all this like cross roll-up transaction taking place, but the user isn't exposed to this.
I've got a question about let's assume probably correctly that OneBalance is going to be phenomenally successful, right? And we're having this podcast in a couple of years and everyone just keeps most of their assets on this cross-chain wallet that we're describing. How does that impact like general purpose L2 business models? Because it seems like when you look at something like the big L2s today, what they're trying to do is make interop a huge part of the way that they're eventually going to monetize. And I've been saying this for a while, but I just don't see much incentive for the L2 frameworks to make interoperability work in between the big frameworks, because that's churn. That's like user churn from their perspective. So in this world of OneBalance, interop actually does work very well in between different L2 frameworks. So how does that impact their ultimate business model, do you think? And yeah, I mean, what's the reception been from like the Optimisms and Arbitrums of the world?
I think that's a fabulous question, and it's like super ahead of its time. I do think that they're actively thinking about this and realizing this, and we're seeing this shift towards the OP stack, the ARB stack, the ZK stack. Like all these teams are seeing that actually supporting application-specific rollups is probably more core to their business than the generalized rollup. So I do see the market shifting in that direction. The other thing that I want to sort of highlight, we co-hosted Sequencing Day a few days ago with Espresso, and it was all talking about the different types of sequencing and how do you do this interoperability at the sort of sequencing layer base rollup, pre-confirmations, all of these things. There's three things that matter when you're talking about interoperability. One of them is interoperability across an asynchronous environment. One of them is atomic inclusion. Transaction A and transaction B are only included on chain if one or the other is, regardless of if they revert or not. The second one is atomic execution. So transaction A and transaction B are only included if both of them execute successfully. And then the third one is like atomic composability, which is transaction A is able to call transaction B, do something, and pass back compute into transaction A before transaction A finish completing. OneBalance only helps with the first two. This is like a really important thing to highlight. Whereas a lot of this like interop conversation of like universal synchronous composability tries to solve the third one, which is atomic composability. Part of the question of like how big will generalized rollup be is how important is atomic composability? Because within a generalized rollup environment, you can do this thing of calling one from one smart contract to another smart contract and back. But across two different rollups, it's much more difficult. Now they're trying to develop ways to do this at like the proof aggregation layer, at like issuing locks on two different sequencers. OneBalance doesn't touch these things. It really focuses on primarily atomic execution and specifically incentivizing atomic execution through the use of resource locks. So the solver is the one that's providing it. The OneBalance account just incentivizes the solvers to do it.
I think, Stephane, if I were to push on that, because this is like, again, what we're doing on the cross stuff too, I would say that the intent framework that OneBalance shares emulates atomic execution.
Correct.
Yeah, and maybe to push on that, just in case listeners are wondering what the hell we're talking about here, we're saying what the solver does is the solver is going to use their own money to execute that code in a way that looks like it just was atomically executed, but it wasn't actually executed by the user. It was executed by the solver, which is how a cross feels intense today and what exactly OneBalance wants to do as well. So the solver looks like it's atomically executing something, but it's doing it on behalf of the user, and then they get paid back later, right? And that to me is the power of this like intent-like architecture, because it lets us do those things by having solvers front money.
I totally agree. Like intent-centric frameworks incentivize atomicity as opposed to enforcing it.
Yeah.
And it creates the opportunity for the solvers to go and provide it. It doesn't mean that it like replaces the need for like proper atomicity at the sequencing level. It's just that becomes an optimization.
Yeah. Which actually, to put it back to Mike's question, because this is something that I've been actually deeply involved in on, so restating your question, there's a world we're potentially barreling towards where Optimism superchain has native interop between superchains. And I'm going to put in like, listeners can't see this, but air quotes what native interop looks like. But native interop on Optimism superchain, native interop on Arbitrum Orbit, native interop on Polygon Egg Layer, native interop on ZK Sync's version of Egg Layer, like Elastic Chain. And you've got these sort of like siloed worlds that are trying to do interop-y things on their stack, but aren't really talking to each other.
Is the interop, at which level is that? Is that composability or is that execution?
So it probably depends on which stack and their version of interop. So like even your thing, like atomic inclusion, atomic execution, none of it is composability in my understanding. Okay. But they're doing different things to allow chains to talk to each other better, right? But they're all doing it in a different way. And then from an Ethereum-centric perspective, this kind of sucks.
Yeah.
Because, like, if you think Vitalik, he's like, okay, wait, I like the diversity in my ecosystem, but I still want a unified Ethereum. And now I no longer have this, like, unified Ethereum. Anyways, the thing that, yeah, Stephane?
Is that true? Why is that not a unified Ethereum?
Well, from a user and from a developer perspective, from both of them, it kind of sucks. So the user's like, okay, wait, I can move my assets between superchain stuffs really easily. I can move my assets between Orbit really easily. This is a world without like what we're doing, without OneBalance, with what a cross is trying to. We're very aligned on this. So I'm saying pretend we don't exist. I have like I can move my assets within each of those ecosystems, but it's really hard to move between them. That kind of sucks. from a developer perspective, if you're developing an application and you want to attract users from all of these ecosystems, do you have to like interface with like 4 different bridging architectures, let's say, to bring assets over? I don't know. Could be messy.
I see. I understand the perspective. I disagree that it's a problem that needs to be solved. I actually think it's great that these ecosystems are developing native interop, because I see all of that as just being better guarantees for solvers.
That's exactly my view too. So I look at it as, so this is all great. The solution is you create a standard that is a standard for intents. And like Stephane, we got to make sure you build OneBalance on top of ERC 7683. But like generally speaking, a standard for cross-chain intents, a very lightweight, no vendor lock-in approach that uses native interop to make it better and faster and cheaper for solvers, but provides a unified experience across all these ecosystems.
That was a big unlock for me. That's super interesting. When we talked about standards and even used the example of standards in terms of the wheels in cars in the US, it actually isn't prescriptive over wheel size. It's prescriptive over whatever the hub is in the center there.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So the right layer basically to prescribe standards at the intent layer.
Yeah. So, okay. What is ERC 7683? That's a standard for cross-chain intents that cross-wrote with Uniswap and a lot of input from the Cake framework folks, from Stephane and all that. But what the effect is like, let's define a way of defining how an asset, using Stephane's words, like bridge, swap, and call. Let's define a way to do that between chains and allow developers to integrate one way of doing this. And like OneBalance is the same way. And then under the surface, the native interop gives, again, I'll steal Stephane's words, gives better guarantees for solvers around how quickly they'll get repaid, basically the security around their execution.
So in the OneBalance framing, we have this idea, which is a resource lock.
Yeah.
And resource locks are just an implementation of the standard. It defines what are the resources that the user commits to, and what are the fulfillment conditions, and what is the mechanism that enforces that fulfillment condition. So it's all built on top of the standard,
which we love. And then it just points towards a unified Ethereum for both users and developers, right? Which again very much fits with like this OneBalance vision, which I love. You developers of applications implement one thing and can source liquidity from any part of the Ethereum landscape. And maybe we add in Solana here too. That'd be pretty cool.
Bitcoin L2s.
Bitcoin L2s as well.
Blockchain.
And then you just, you have full abstraction.
Yeah, Ton.
Why are you laughing, Mike?
No, I'm not laughing.
A lot of users of Ton, right?
Yeah,
There's probably...
No, there are.
I don't know how many people listen to your podcast, but...
Probably less than there are Ton users. You know what this just points to, though? It's just... it feels like the business model of a lot of I think the business model of blockchains is yet to be solved. And it feels like the way that we've tried to figure this out is to say, hey, I want users to come into my execution environment and be sticky. And that's gotten more complicated as we've moved execution off like ETH main chain into L2 land. And what I'm hearing from the two of you is that there's going to be we talked about this a lot in our season, but that there's going to be this standard, and then that the intent layer is going to focus, like the sticky part of users is going to be with applications. And I think a lot of this stuff where we're trying to actually build these moats around different execution environments are going to be commoditized over time. I think that's the macro trend here.
Block space is not scarce.
Yeah. It's abundant.
Yeah. But like this is potentially very disruptive to our industry, which, for a long time, people have made their money off of selling block space.
Right.
And that's like the kind of tried and true business model to date. And so it does make my head hurt a little bit about what this would look like. But if you step back and think about it from like a Web 2 perspective, the way a Web 2 business makes money, there's actually two ways. And Stephane, we can talk about this with relation to OneBalance too. But a Web 2 business makes money either by users and having their attention, and then like charging them. I mean, maybe it's paid for in advertising, whatever, but they have users, they have eyeballs, and they make money off of eyeballs by either charging them for something or whatever else. The other way a Web 2 business makes money, and I'm thinking like fintech here, is they have assets. Like you have a wallet with assets. Think like Robinhood makes money off of holding user assets and making money off of things people are doing with that money. And in a sense, Stephane, I think we actually talked about this
It's interesting.
a while back, but your OneBalance arguably could hold assets. Like if it really works, it's kind of like this wallet that holds money. And that's a valuable place to be, which is kind of cool.
My VCs will like that.
You know what?
I should just point them to you.
That's the third bit of Here, you know what this reminds me of though is there's a phenomenal. Do you guys listen to Acquired, the podcast?
I used to.
They do these like 4 hour or like sometimes 9 hour deep dives on different.
Amazing.
It's
right?
awesome, yeah. And I just listened to the one that they did on Microsoft in the early days and how they got their start. And Bill Gates, one of the things that he got right was about not being super value extractive for building like the Microsoft platform. And he always said, you know, the applications that build on us and the developers that are building applications should create 2, 3, 4 times as much value as we're creating ourselves. And I feel like that's the world that, you know, in the same way that we're speedrunning a lot of the lessons that finance has figured out basically centuries ago, I think we're speedrunning some of the lessons of Web 2 at the same time.
I want to add a third category to your framework.
Wait, what were the first two?
Attention, capital.
Yeah.
Those are the two that you sort of mentioned. I think the third one is trust. And that is what blockchains have tried to make scarce using block space. It's the access to the validator set to be able to attest to a certain agreement. I do think that trust is valuable and something that people have like shown to be willing to pay for. Now, with the restaking stuff, we're kind of like saying, how do we fractionalize this trust such that it's like you can pick and choose the amount of trust that you want using some economic metric. It's good for some use cases. I don't think it's good for all use cases, but I still think that trust is something that is valuable.
I'm going to push back on that. I think trust is it's an attribute. It is part of a moat that fits into an asset business, but I'm not sure. Like actually, I think about trust a lot because when I think about the asset that we're building at Blockworks as a media company, it's literally trust. At the end of the day, we manufacture insights and people have to trust them. But I actually think media is an interesting example of this model of like trust, and because it actually is, it's trust, but it's also attention. And we've watched trad media basically have half of their value proposition cleaved off because they're no longer gatekeepers of attention, but they still have trust. And I think you're figuring out that
I don't even know if they have trust anymore.
I don't even know if they do either. They're losing that too. Well, it's probably not an accident that when they lost the audience, they're losing the trust because now there are other megaphones and places where audience live where they're getting different information, and they're losing the trust.
You were squirming when I said the trust thing.
I was squirming because I mean, I don't know that I agree. It's like trust should be free in a world of cheap block space is my thought. And it's not free, very cheap in a world of cheap block space. And I'm kind of like, and I also, that then goes into Mike's point where it's like, for you to have attention at scale with longevity, you need trust, which would be the Web3 version here too. Like applications that build in Web3 have to be trustworthy. Otherwise, what the hell is your decentralization thing giving you? And
well, what do you make of USDT and Tron? That's like the data point that stands in stark contrast to all this, right?
But also, it has been like transferring USDT on Tron has been trustworthy to date.
Yeah.
It's like one of those things that I think there's a little bit of like a Western bias here where our versions of it and the way we think Web3 should work doesn't follow Tron.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people in a lot of places in the world, it's offered them a valuable service that they trust.
Yeah.
For not the same reasons we do or don't trust it, but
Proof of authority is still a valid source of trust.
I also
Proof of Justin Sun.
proof of sun. Proof of excellency.
Proof of sun. Proof of excellency.
Proof of excellency.
I think if you maybe this is the I've been in the space too long thing, but like if you look at any of these systems, I sort of reduce them down to some form of proof of authority. There's social consensus like backing any of these things, and it's easy to say like, oh, my proof of authority is better than that one. But I do think that fundamentally it kind of reduces down to the same.
I mean, Vitalik is better than Justin Sun, though.
I like him better too.
Me too. I think proof of authority, it's funny that private blockchains got a little bit of a rebrand and now we call it proof of authority and it sounds less grating on the ears, but I think that's going to experience a bit of a renaissance and people are going to I think one of the big things that people are realizing is vanilla proof of stake. There are a lot of drawbacks with vanilla proof of stake, and so now people are going to, I think, starting to, I mean, that's why delegated proof of stake is a very different form of consensus, but I think even proof of authority chains people are going to start to experiment much more with those. And I mean, they've already, I guess, done that, but I think that's going to be continually coming into good graces.
And the other component to this is not every job needs to be done by the same trust model.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of like the inside of L2s. Like, if the custody is not part of your consensus thing, then you can kind of just run a centralized sequencer and everyone's happy. But that's just like proof of authority on sequencing, but not on asset ownership.
Do you think, and shout out to Espresso, I know you guys did that day, I'm a big fan of Espresso as well. Do you think that 5 years from now, do you think that all the L2s are going to still be running a centralized sequencer, or is there going to be more decentralized sequencing?
I think there'll be all kinds of flavors.
Okay.
I think centralized sequencing will still exist in a major way.
Yeah.
How major, don't know. But like, I actually think the way you articulated that, Stephane, about like, okay, if it's not custodying your assets, but it's just, doing execution on top of them, totally cool to have that be done by a centralized sequencer for many use cases.
That's the OG state channel, payment channel stuff, right?
Yeah.
All right, fellows. This has been a ton of fun. I think we got to start winding down relatively soon here. But Stephane, we already gave you the OneBalance, .io plug here. But in case users missed that,
2 times, you got it twice.
Twice, yeah. But if you want to find out more or whatever, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, OneBalance.io is really the best way.
3 times.
Follow us on Twitter. One thing that we're doing now, which is quite cool, is we're doing like super technical deep dives on the entire Credible stack with partners. And so the next one that we'll be hosting will be around solver networks. And we're just going to go deep into saying like, okay, what does the Credible stack, what do Credible accounts, what does OneBalance mean for this layer? And so, yeah, we're just going like one by one on all of this. So just follow us on Twitter and you'll get access to all of this.
Awesome.
All right.
Awesome.
Fun, guys. We'll have to do it again soon.
One team, one dream. Let's go.
One team, one dream, one click,
one balance, one click. Let's go.
All right, guys, one more shout out here to this episode's title sponsor, Sei. There are a ton of reasons to build on Sei. If you're itching to get started building or using the ecosystem, head over to sei.io. That's SEI.io. Get started and be sure to let them know that we sent you. Thank you, Sei.